Okay, thank you everybody for coming. We are continuing our shiur on tefillah. Last week we studied the bracha of Ahava Rabbah, and we finished our discussion of that second bracha, which is a form of Birchat Torah. As we saw, just like the earliest forms of Birkat Torah, Ahava Rabbah was designed as a form of blessing before one reads the Keriat Shema. And we studied how in its earliest forms, Ahava Rabbah was probably a much simpler bracha, and it probably has its roots in the styles of the earliest Birkot Torah and the earliest blessings that one would say before reading the Torah. Now, tonight, we're going to move on to something connected to the bracha of Habocher B'Amo Yisrael Be'ahava, and that is the portion which is added in the Sidurim, which is known as Kel Melech Ne'eman. Now, those three words, Kel Melech Ne'eman, means, our king, our God, the faithful king. Those three words are very simple. But if you look in many, many Sidurim, you will find that it is almost second nature. That's Sidurim, mostly Ashkenaz Sidurim, but Sidurim, both Ashkenazi and Sephardi, will have within them, right before Shema Yisrael, the sentence Kel Melech Ne'eman. And depending on the siddur, you'll find different instructions for whether or not to say Kel Melech Ne'eman before Shema Yisrael. Some of them will add it with instructions, some of them will add it without. But by far and large, this is a feature that we find in many Sidurim. Now, it comes to mind something Gary said last week after we finished recording. He mentioned Rabbi Weissmandel used to say that if you said Habocher B'Amo Yisrael Be'ahava, if you said such a bracha of Ahava Rabbah without tears in your eyes, there's probably something wrong with you. Now, that's a rabbi speaking. A Rav or Moshe Meir Weissmandel had a tremendous heart. So my apologies. For him to say something like that is very natural. And it brought to mind to me here that one of the things we have to remember when we study tefillah is that this is not just a study of the development of liturgical literature. Studying tefillah cannot be a slavish a study slavishly connected to the text. Although it's tempting to dissect the text as we did last week and to take it apart and show how certain parts are earlier and talk about different styles, it could be very tempting to study liturgy academically or even rabbinically as a text and a text that people read rather than a thing that people do. Liturgy, when we study tefillah, we have to understand something that the basic of mispalalim understand. Even though the simplest worshipers understand that when they pray, the words that they're praying are not synonymous with the siddur, right? How people pray and what they do, and their relationship to Hashem, a person's relationship to Hashem and how he connects to God is related to, but not identical with, the tefillah and the siddur. And it's important to understand when we study liturgy that it has to be multifaceted and multidisciplinary. You have to look at it at every angle, not just from dissecting the text itself, but also from understanding that prayer is not just something people read. It is not a text that people read. Prayer is a thing that people do. And very often, when we find little habits like Kel Melech Ne'eman, which persist throughout the generations, there's more to study there, not just in the text, not just in the halacha and the rabbinical discussion, which we're going to look at tonight. There's more than just the rabbinical discussion. There's something there. There's something in Kel Melech Ne'eman. There's some sort of ritual, some tick, some kind of habit, which was appealing to people, which psychologically and religiously is a really important idea to study. Somebody who put this forward in one of his books, it was Lawrence Hoffman. In one of his books, he has a book called Beyond the Text, where he argues for studying liturgy in a multidisciplinary approach. And he has one line from the book that I always remembered. I can't recite it verbatim, but I just wanted to read this to you because I brought it with me to give you an idea. He says, if we learn to see liturgy as transcending words, even great words, we inherit a window on the past and present alike, in which the image on the other side of the glass may look remarkably like ourselves. Essentially saying that we have to be able to see, we have to be able to study the tefillah above the text itself. And we're going to study Kel Melech Ne'eman tonight, but we have to recognize that there might be more to it here. There might be a stream of consciousness that went through the Jewish people in the past 1,000 years that led us to this place where everyone says Kel Melech Ne'eman, or at least many people say Kel Melech Ne'eman. Not necessarily is there a halachic thread, but there's usually a thread of emotion, a thread of spirituality that takes you from the beginning, the genesis of a custom like this, all the way till today. So let's begin with, you know what, let's begin with this. This is actually a pendant from the 20th century. These were very popular in Western Europe right before the war. And we don't know why, but many women would buy these pendants in Western Europe. And it had a picture of Moshe Rabbeinu holding the luchos, and on the other side, it said, Kel Melech Ne'eman Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. And in that, you kind of see unfortunately, all of the women who wore these bracelets are dead. Archaeologists found in Sobibor, unfortunately, the concentration camp where they murdered groups of women one after the other. They found these amulets, which were seemingly very popular among Jewish women at the time. Now, who made them, why they made them, that information was extinguished with the murder of the Nazis. But something we see from these amulets, and I'm sure many amulets that go back generations before them, is that these amulets were designed and created for the anxieties of Jewish people at the time, justified anxieties, obviously, because they were being brought to very dangerous places and usually to their deaths. So we see just the point that I'm showing with this here is that Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, which are the most important words that Jewish women would even hold on their chest before they died, was prefaced by Kel Melech Ne'eman. And Kel Melech Ne'eman, even though it's a medieval custom, and it's only began, we only have evidence of it beginning around 1,000 years ago, and it doesn't go back to Chazal, it doesn't go back to the Nevi'im, it doesn't go back earlier than that. This minhag clearly speaks to the Jewish people, and it clearly became a part and parcel of Shema Yisrael somehow. Now, we don't understand how, we don't understand the mysteries of how Kel Melech Ne'eman exactly became, exactly became a part of the Shema Yisrael, but we're going to do our very best tonight to explore those origins. So let me just check my notes because I didn't have time to print them out tonight. Okay, so in order to understand this better, we have to turn to medieval Italy. The earliest source we have for the custom of saying Kel Melech Ne'eman comes from the Anav family of northern Italy. Now, medieval Italy is a very difficult time to study, at least regarding the Jewish people, because Italy had its vicissitudes. There were times of ups and downs for all of the communities, whether they were in the northern region or in the southern Apulian region. Roughly between the 800s all the way to the roughly 1100s, there was, and even 1200s, there was a tremendous amount of scholarship and a tremendous amount of persecution. And the Jews moved around Italy from north to south and south to north, all the way up and down, essentially. It's a little complicated and out of scope to discuss tonight. But one of the most important families that was in northern Italy was the Anav family. If you spell it in English, it's A-N-A-W. And they were zeicha to have their own Jewish encyclopedia page, like their own Wikipedia page, if you ever want to look them up. The Anav family was a medieval family which claims to be one of the 4 prominent families that was brought by Titus they were deported by Titus to Rome after the destruction of Bayis Sheni. And historians have found traces of this family as far back as the 10th century, meaning the 900s, and all the way to like the 1300s, right? The 14th century, all the way until then, there are still traces of this family. It's a very chashuva family. There are a lot of rabbanim in it. One of the most famous of two of the most famous people of the Anav family was the author of the Sefer Aruch, Rav Nassan Bar Yechiel Miroma, and also the Shibbolei Haleket, Rav Tzidkiah HaRofei and his brother Rabbi Binyamin. These were also very big Gedalim and rabbis of the Anav family. Many of them were Reish Yeshiva and Rabbanim and Rashi Kahal in their time and place. Now, the Shibbolei Haleket, one of these members of the Anav family, I'm sorry, I forgot to share my screen. I'll come back here. Right, so this is, yeah, of course, the Archer Titus and the slave. This is the slaves being taken away, the Jewish slaves being brought to Rome. And in this next slide, we have a depiction of medieval Italy. So in the Shibbolei Haleket, in number Tesvav, he brings down a medrash, which essentially started it all. There's a very mysterious medrash in Tanhuma. Okay. This medrash in Tanhuma says as follows. It says, Amar of money, like to take Keriat Shema kala beinecha, mipnei sheyesh ba ramach tevot. Right? Inside Keriat Shema, there's 248 words. Keneged evarim sheba adam. Umehem baruch shem kavod malchuto l'olam va'ed, including the pasuk of Baruch Shem. That might be a later interpolation, but whatever. Amar Kadosh Baruch Hu, im shamartem sheli lekrota kitikna. If you watch my mitzvos and you are careful to read it properly, afani 248 letters, I will be careful with your 248 limbs. Lekach David Mikales, therefore David says, Shomreni kishon bat ayin. Guard me like the pupil of your eye. Amar le'Kadosh Baruch Hu, Shemor mitzvotai v'chaya. Watch my commandments and live. And Rav Shimon Chalafta gives a whole mashal for how it's like one person says, watch my stuff, watch my vineyard, and I'll watch your thing. Same idea. Okay. So the problem with this midrash is that it says in this Tanhuma, by Rav Mani, which some versions have Rav Mana, that Keriat Shema has 248 words. But if you actually sit down and do the math, if you include Baruch Shem Kvod Malchuto L'Olam Va'ed, there's actually only 244. If you add Emet, then there's 245. So what happened to the last three letters? So the Shibbolei Haleket attacks this problem. And he says that I heard from Rabbi Daniel Miroma. And who is Rabbi Daniel Miroma? He calls him Rabbi Daniel HaGaon. I heard from Rabbi Daniel HaGaon an interpretation. So Rabbi Daniel HaGaon was the brother of Rav Natan Miroma, who is the Sefer HaAruch, right? The author of the Sefer HaAruch. His father was a prominent Rabbi Yechiel, who's one of the Rabbanim in Rome. Daniel was the older brother of the Sefer HaAruch, and he died a little bit before. He died, I think, in like 1101, and the Sefer HaAruch actually named one of his children after his brother. So Rabbi Daniel was a prominent rabbi who his name is signed on many decrees in Rome. And it's actually not unlikely that Rabbi Daniel Gaon met, I don't know why they call him Gaon, but it's very likely he met Rav Hai Gaon, because Rav Hai Gaon in the 1000s came to Italy to give classes. And it's quite likely, if he was the Aruch's older brother, that he met Rav Hai Gaon, who was the last Gaon of Pupadita. For some reason, because of Rabbi Daniel's prominence, they called him Rabbi Daniel Gaon. It was still an era when people were doing things like that. And regardless, Rabbi Daniel Gaon says as follows. He says that because we are missing those three words, three words from the 245, from the 248, therefore the takana was they added the Chazal added three extra words, Kel Melech Ne'eman, in order to fill that lacuna, in order to fill that void. Let me just read to you the Lashon very quickly. He says, and I heard the teachers of Daniel Gaon, Ramat Tevot yesh b'Keriat Shema, v'osifu aleim Kel Melech Ne'eman, shehin shalosh tevot, which are three words, Kadei sheyalu leminyan ramach, keneged ramach evarim shebe'adam. V'chein katav Rabbeinu Shlomo, and so Rashi says as well, B'Sefer HaPardes shechiber, in the Sefer HaPardes which he wrote. Now, Rashi was roughly contemporary of the Sefer HaAruch, but I don't know if Rashi himself was as old as Rabbi Daniel Gaon. Regardless, in the 1000s already, we find, at least in the late 11th century, we find Rabbi Daniel Gaon explaining this midrash with a pre-existing minhag known to him in Italy. And then Rashi, who comes from Troyes in France, or Worms in Germany, depending where you consider his scholarship to have been, but Rashi himself is aware of this minhag as well. And in the Master Vitri and the Sefer HaPardes, he brings this minhag, and we find this custom well known to the scholars of Germany and France, whether it's, I mean, all of the scholars of Germany and France, I'm blanking. I'm sorry. Rugas Habaisem, all of roughly like any of the scholars who were from Provence, France, Germany, all of those, the Orchot Chaim, Rabbi Aaron Milunel, many of those scholars were very aware of this tradition of this midrash of adding Kel Melech Ne'eman for the purpose of getting to 248 limbs or 248 words. This was the earliest explanation they had for why Kel Melech Ne'eman was put before Keriat Shema. But none of them actually know the most ancient origin. It seems to have been a pre-existing fact in their time that people would say Kel Melech Ne'eman before Shema Yisrael. They didn't know for sure. This seems like Rabbi Daniel Gaon was giving a teret, like it says v'tiretz, like he gave a teretz, but not as if they knew this for certainty. So we might be dealing with an ideological answer, not a knowledge from answer, not a knowledge from not an answer from tradition, but an answer from ideology. So what could we say for the earliest makar for Kel Melech Ne'eman? The answer is we have no idea. The one scholar, I think it was Louis Finkelstein, literally conjectured that the end of the bracha, the ancient bracha, Sher Kedushanos B'Sveises V'Tzivanu Al Kriyas Shema Lamlichai Belev of Shalem, that ancient bracha, which is no longer said, at the end of the bracha probably had the words Kel Melech Ne'eman. And because it had the words Kel Melech Ne'eman as part of that bracha, people were used to saying it, and therefore they would say Kel Melech Ne'eman before they said Shema Yisrael. But that's complete conjecture, and we don't have actually any manuscripts to back that up. So I understand the desire, or it's very tempting to try to find something really ancient from the Dark Ages and say, that bracha is the makar for it, and that's why it came up. There's no Gemara about it. There's no makar for it in Chazal. There's no makar for it in the Ga'inim. So it's very tempting to find some place where maybe it comes from, but without actual tangible evidence, we really can't make a conjecture like that. Okay, so in the 1960s, we've discussed Professor Yisrael Tashma before. He was the world expert on Minhag Ashkenaz HaKadmon, and really one of the world experts on early Ashkenazic custom and early Ashkenazic culture and history. He wrote a very important sefer called Minhag Ashkenaz HaKadmon, which explores both the minhag and the halacha that was prevalent in the area we would call the Rhineland, right? In the Rhineland area of along the Rhine River, the Jews who existed and lived among the Rhine River. So he devotes a chapter to Kel Melech Ne'eman, and he demonstrates quite conclusively that the Ashkenazi and French communities, and eventually the Provençal communities, which were in southern France, those communities were the ones that were familiar with this minhag, but nobody else, right? You have the Italians, and then the Italians all migrate to Germany, and then France or France-Germany, whatever you want to call that area, and then a little bit later, Provence, but nobody else. The Spanish, the Babylonians, the Temanim, the Greek, the Romans, nobody else. Sorry, not the Romans, the Greeks, any other group of Jews, nobody else had this minhag, and nobody else had this misorah. We don't find scholars from other areas hearing about this misorah until the early 1200s. And a lot of it is based on one of the most interesting tshuvos from the Meiri. The Meiri was a Provençal scholar. He was from southern France, and he wrote a Pirush al Shas very famously, but he also has a tshuva, Sefer HaTshuvos. And in the Sefer HaTshuvos, in the beginning, in Inyan Rishon, it's a very interesting historical tshuva, and the whole tshuva is really about Kel Melech Ne'eman. And he tells a fascinating story. He tells a story about Rav Zerachia Halevi. Rav Zerachia Halevi is famously known as the Baal HaMa'ar, the one who wrote the Sefer HaMa'ar. For anybody who learned in yeshiva, you'll know what that is. So Rav Zerachia Halevi was from the 1100s, right? He lived in the mid-12th century, and he was born in Girona in Spain, and which is today Catalonia, also, the Catalonian region in Spain. And Rabbi Zerachia Halevi, although he was born in Girona, he went to Provence to learn. And in Provence, he encountered this custom. The Meiri says the truth is, the earliest versions of the Provençal nusach, the early versions of the Catalonia nusach, most of the Sfarad, and he says the West and the East. I think he means the Western European Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire. None of the earliest minhagim had this minhag, but we in Provence, we know of this minhag, and Rav Levi learned it from us, and he took it back to Girona, Girona. So he took it back to Girona and he established it there. He thought it was he heard about the numerology, he heard about the idea of 248, and he brought it back to the city. And then what happened was that after he was niftar, right at the end of the 1100s, so in the early 1200s, the early 13th century, the Ramban was made known of this minhag by his talmidim. His talmidim who had gone to Provence and come back, they had gotten wind of this minhag. The Ramban was asked to, when he, at least in his youth, was asked about this, and he was very troubled by it. He didn't really feel like he had the authority himself to take down this minhag of saying Kel Melech Ne'eman, but he thought it was very mistaken. He's like, how could you say Kel Melech Ne'eman in between a Bocher Bar Moisol Be'ava and Shema Yisrael? This is technically like a Birchas HaMitzvos or Birchas HaTorah. So saying Kel Melech Ne'eman in between is very much a hefsek. So what he did is that he approached Rav Meir Halevi Abulafia. Rav Meir Halevi Abulafia is known as the Ramah. And the Ramah was a big expert. I think he died in like 1244 or 1242. He was a big expert in early Spanish custom. So he knew the past 200, 300 years of Spanish custom, the early Spanish custom. And he said, nope, we do not do this in Spain. We did not do this in Spain. This is not something that we do. And I'll read you the language that he has here. And he has a polemic against it. I wonder if I could share my screen. Let's see. I show all windows. Let's see. It's useful to see this. Okay. I'll find it together here. V'yesh omrim semosifin amen kel Melech Ne'eman because the Ramah chevarim v'haramah heshiv al zeh b'tshuva v'katav. Right, the Ramah answered, "Vada im hiktim v'sayim bocher b'moisol be'ava kodem shiach tzibur yachol la'anot amen." If you finish Ava Rabba before the Shiach Tzibur, and then the Shiach Tzibur ends Habocher Bar Moisol Be'ava, you could answer Amen to the Shiach Tzibur. That's not a hefsek, that's answering Amen, right? Aval mi, that's just a halachic point. Aval mi she'ana, let me just close that tab, sorry. Aval mi she'oneh Amen acher b'chat atzmo, ben b'yachid ben b'tzibur havei ta'ut, v'nekra bor. Person is not allowed to answer Amen after himself. You crazy? You can't. That's a triple hefsek. If you add Kel Melech Ne'eman, you're making a hefsek between the bracha and the kriya of Shema. You're saying Kel for no reason. Let me just skip a little bit here. And here's where he uses strong language. This addition, lo Yaakov amro, v'lo banav. Yaakov Avinu didn't say it, and not his sons. V'lo Moshe amro, Moshe didn't say it. Meaning, we know that Yaakov Avinu said Baruch Shem Kavod Malchutz L'Olam V'ed, and he said Shema, and his sons answered Baruch Shem. And Moshe Rabbeinu doesn't say it in the Torah. So he's being poetic, but he's saying there's no makar for this. And if Yaakov didn't say it and Moshe didn't say it, how could we say such a thing? Okay, a little bit further here. All right, so essentially he says, if you could get away with not doing this, don't do this. If you're in a community where everybody does it, try to get your way out of this, because this is a terrible hefsek and nobody should do such a thing. And he was not convinced by the numerology argument. He didn't really like this argument that, you need to fill Ramah chevarim. Let me just give you some context here as to what he's talking about. So to understand the Ramah a little bit better, I want to look at these Gemaras. First of all, there's a Gemara in Yerushalmi. The Yerushalmi says that a person is not allowed to answer Amen after his own bracha. Vim Ana, it says, Haporis Tani, Haporis Shema over of Teva, Vanosi et Kapava, Kre, Betorava, Maftir, Benavim, Rechalach becomes with the more Betorah, Loyana, Achar, small. Amen. Vim Ana, Hariz Abor. A person who answers Amen after his own bracha is just boorish, he's foolish, he's an ignoramus. The Gemara asks, is tinayet tanay harei zabor? So one halacha says that a person is an ignoramus, vis tinayet tanay harei zachacham, but some halachas read that a person is a chacham if he does this. So how do we resolve this contradiction? The Gemara says, Amar Rav Chisda, man damar harei zachacham be'oneh besof. Man damar harei zabor be'oneh al bracha. A person who is a chacham is a person who does amen at the end of all the brachot. Uman damar, when a person is an ignoramus, is if he's answering at the end of each and every bracha. So essentially, what the Gemara is saying here is that if you are finishing a set, like a whole set of brachos, then the last one you could answer amen to show that it's the end. So, like the famous example that the Bavli gives is Bonei Yerushalayim. At the end of Berachas Hamazon, we say Bonei Yerushalayim, and then we say amen because we're ending a set of 3 brachos d'oraisa. The last bracha is a d'Rabbanan. And therefore, the Gemara here seems to be saying that if you're finishing a series of brachos, you could answer amen. The Meiri uses this as defense. He says, Habocher B'Ramo Yisrael Ba'ava is the end of a series of brachos, so you should be able to answer amen, and it would not be a hefsek. Second of all, says the Gemara, okay, so this is another Gemara which says that amen here is like kel Melech Ne'eman. So this is what the Ramban says. No, sorry, this is the Ramban's reply. The Talmidim of the Ramban said, okay, you're telling us it's a hefsek, but we have this medrash here about Ramach Evarim, and we have this story here that you have to fill it. That we have this minhag that people used to say Kel Melech Ne'eman for this reason. So here's the medrash. What do you do with the medrash? So the Ramban answered as follows. He says, well, we know the Gemara says that amen stands for Kel Melech Ne'eman. So what must have happened is like this. The Ramban invents this history. He says it must be that in the olden days, the Shliach Tzibur used to say the brachos for everybody because they didn't know the brachos. And they would answer amen to the Shliach Tzibur, and then everybody would reach Shema together. So because they would answer amen to the Shliach Tzibur, that wasn't ideal since you shouldn't be answering amen there. And instead, they put Kel Melech Ne'eman because that's similar to amen. And that's the reason it showed up there. It's a very strange excuse to give because that doesn't solve your problem of hefsek. He says the whole takana was only for congregations of amei haaretz, of people who were ignorant, who were laymen and didn't really understand the halacha. That's why they made this whole takana. Very interesting argument. And the Meiri doesn't like it at all. He takes it apart. He's like, what are you talking about? Like, they know how to say Keriat Shema, but they don't know how to say the brachas. He doesn't, and what, the Talmidei Chachamim are going to be saying it wrong. And he didn't like the whole thing. And essentially the Meiri defends this custom, the Provençal custom. But let's look at what the Ramban does. The Gemara in Brachas, Daf Mem Hey Amud Beis, says as follows. Says Tani Chada Ha'one Amen Achar Birchotav Harei Meshubach Tani Ida Harei Mugana. Right. So it says some we have just like the Yerushalmi asks. Some braysos say that if you say Amen after your brachos, that's a great thing. Some braysos say it's a terrible thing. So the Gemara says no. This is by Bonei Yerushalayim. This is by other brachos. By Bonei Yerushalayim, when it's the end of a series, you could say Amen after your own bracha, and it's not silly. But if you say it after each and every bracha that you say, if you say Baruch Hashem Elokeinu Melech Shakoni Bevaro Amen, you sound like a fool and you are a fool. That's essentially what the Gemara's position is here. Look at what the Ritva does here. The Ritva, who's a 14th century Rishon from Spain, says, Ulefichach, b'makom amen tiknu lomar achar avat kel melech ne'eman. Tu chad min pirusha de amen. Kedita behara v'tiknu kein lahashlim ramach tevot de Keriat Shema keneged ramach evrim. Kedita b'agada. בהגדתה, וכן במקומות שנוהגים שהציבור אומרים ברכות קריאת שמע עם שליח ציבור, אלה שמקדימים לחתום באהבת העולם, ושליח ציבור חוזר וחותם, אף כאן הדין כן, שהם חייבים לענות אמן, או כל מלך נאמן, שאין זה עונה אחר ברכת עצמו, אלא אחר ברכת חברו. However, במקומות שהציבור חוזרים עם שליח ציבור, it says if everybody finishes at the same time as the שליח ציבור, then you're not allowed to answer amen or kel melech ne'eman afterwards. Right, exactly. So in a similar vein here, he gives a whole nother history to the Kel Melech Ne'eman. He says that it's to fill the Ramach Evarim, but it's again in lieu of the words Amen. So should I get into the complexity above? Let me see. I'm not sure if we should go into that now. Okay, yeah. Well, let's leave that aside. Okay, the last thing we have to see regarding this problem is a much later development. And by much later, I mean about 45 years later. So let me give you some context here. As we've just realized, in Spain, we have a polemic. We have an argument between the Spanish scholars and the Provençal scholars about whether or not it is okay to say Melech Ne'eman. Some of them seem to say that you can do it only if the chazan ends before you, and if you end before the chazan and you're answering for the chazan, then you're answering amen, then you could say either amen or Kel Melech Ne'eman. And if you want to say Kel Melech Ne'eman to get to those 3 extra words, great. But otherwise, it's a hefsek. Don't do it. Don't do it if you finish at the same time as shiur, because you can't answer amen after your own bracha. That seems to be the argument of the Spanish scholars. If you move to the end, if you go to Toledo, you get Rav Moshe de Leon. Rav Moshe de Leon was the first person to pen the Zohar, to put the Zohar to writing. And depending on what camp you're in, either he was writing a medrash, which was not revealed until that time, right? That's the opinion of many from Jews. They believe that Moshe de Leon wrote the Zohar, which is a secret medrash, which was never revealed until his time, and he was the first one to put pen to paper and to publish it. Others believe Moshe de Leon was a pseudepigraphic author, and he forged many of these midrashim because he wanted to sell them and he wanted to make more money. Now, without taking sides tonight, if we look at the Zohar in Rus, and I didn't pull it up together tonight, but the Zohar in Rus says something interesting. The Zohar in Rus says that yes, you need to finish Ramach Ivarim, right? It brings a discussion between Tanaim. The Tanaim are having this discussion, and they say that you need to say the 248 words of Keriat Shema because that protects every spiritual aspect of your body, and all of the not just the physical aspects of your body, but it also protects the spiritual and elevates the spiritual aspects of your body. And the Zohar over there says that we accomplish this not by saying Kel Melech Ne'eman. Rather, we accomplish this by saying Hashem Elokechem Emet, by repeating the last 3 words of Keriat Shema. Now, this is a bombshell because, as far as we know, there was no such custom in early Spain. We don't have any such record from the Gaonim, from the Rishonim, anything before the Zohar of such a custom existing. Right? Today, it's very common. You go to shul, at the end of Ma'ariv, you hear Hashem Elokechem Emes, and everyone begins Emes V'Emunah, or Hashem Elokechem Emes, and everyone begins Emes V'Yatziv. So, what in the world is the Zohar doing here? And where does this come from? So, the answer is this comes from a Gemara in Daf Yud Daled Amud Beis in Brachos, and the Gemara in Daf Yud Daled Amud Beis in Brachos brings a mimer from a saying from Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says that the pasuk in Yirmiyah in Yud, the pasuk in Yirmiyah there says Vashem Elokim Emes. So Amar B'Abo Amar B'Yechanan Halach Rabbi Yehuda da Amar Ben Hashem Elokechem L'Emes Yatziv Lo Yafsek. Amar B'Abo Amar B'Yechanan Ma'atem Rabbi Yehuda L'Chsev Vashem Elokim Emes. What the Gemara is saying is that the tefillah called Emes V'Yatziv comes right after Hashem Elokechem. Rabbi Yehuda in the Mishnah says that a person cannot make an interruption between Hashem Elokechem and Emes, because the pasuk says Hashem Elokim Emes. You have to connect those 2 parts. Hashem Elokim and the Emes V'Yatziv have to go together. So the Gemara asks a very obvious question. Wait a second. Is Chayzer Emes or Ein Chayzer Emes? The Gemara is trying to figure out, is this Emes that you're saying, is this a separate Emes, or is this the Emes of Emes V'Yatziv? Are you talking about like a separate? Do you have to say the word Emes separately to fulfill the pasuk in Yirmiyah and say Vashem Elokim Emes, or do you just mean the pasuk of Emes V'Yatziv? Amar B'Abo Amar B'Yechanan Chayzer Emes. Rabbi Amar Ein Chayzer Emes Hahu Denachs K'mei Rabbi Shemai Rabbi Amar Emes Teri Zimni Amar Rabbi Kol Emes Tafsi Lahai. This person said Emes too many times. So the Gemara seems to paskin that a person does not say Emes twice. Right? That's why today, when the Chazan repeats Hashem Elokechem Emes, we say V'Yatziv V'Nachon V'Kayam Yashar, because you're not going to say Emes a second time. We don't say Emes V'Yatziv anymore. So we just include the Emes when the Chazan says those last 3 words. Okay? Or when you're saying it privately, you say Hashem Elokechem Emet, right? You connect the 2, And then later you say v'yatziv v'nachon, even though technically the bracha is emet v'yatziv. That's the original, that is the original structure and text of the blessing is emet v'yatziv. Many of the sidurim move the word emet closer to Shema because of Hashem Elokim emet. Now, nowhere in this Gemara do we have anything that tells us anywhere or any information about adding the last three words. So Professor Tashma thinks that this is just Moshe de Leon up to his old tricks. And he finds another tshuva from Moshe de Leon where he says that, and he brings the whole discussion between the Ramban and the Meiri, and he says, I heard there are rabbis who argue about Kel Melech Ne'eman, and they argue about whether or not you're allowed to say this as a hefsek for between Habochar B'Moisel Ba'ava and Shema. He says, first, I don't understand what these rabbis are arguing about at all. Why would you make a hefsek between Habochar B'Moisel Ba'ava and Shema Yisrael? Why would you do a hefsek? The Medrash says, I don't know how these rabbis didn't see this Medrash. I know there's a Medrash, and I think he calls it Yerushalmi. Like he says something that is a little bit in Congress. He says there's this medrash that I saw that says that you have to repeat Hashem Elokim emes, the Hashem Elokeichem emes, the chazan as the last three words, and that fulfills the requirement of getting three extra words for Keriat Shema. So the way Tashma sees it is that he sees this as De Leon being frustrated. Essentially, in most tefillahs that at least in their time, the chazan would end a section of tefillah by repeating the last words, right? Just like we do at Hallel, right? The people in the Ashkenazim will say the last words of Hallel, and then everybody will say the next paragraph. Or at the end of Kol HaNeshama Tehaloka Hallelujah, the chazan would repeat Kol HaNeshama Tehaloka Hallelujah to tell everybody we just finished this section, right? That's how they used to do it. That's how they would either say Amen or they would repeat the last words. So he had a brilliant idea. Let's just add the last three words. The chazan will repeat the last three words outline, and everybody will listen to him, and will be yaitse. Everybody will listen to the chazan. They'll be yaitse the last three words. So he believes that Moshe de Leon invented this as a halachic solution to fix the hefsek problem. What ends up happening is that I think it's the Darkei Moshe in Siman Samach Aleph. Do I have the whole thing open here? I don't. Yeah. So the Ramah ends up saying, let me find the Shulchan Aruch. Appreciate the Shulchan Aruch Archaim. Here we go. I want to open it, but I'm not downstairs. My apologies. So I don't have everything that I need in front of me. Right. The Keriat Shema says the Machaber Yesh Ramah Tevot. There's 245 words. Let's look at the Halacha L'Maisa, right? The Machaber says that some people say that in order to fill 248, right? So the Shulchan Aruch saw this Zohar. Shulchan Aruch actually paskins like this Zohar, and he says this is the halacha. And the Ramah says, Kol Adam Yotzei v'hoil v'shomim m'piv shel shiach tzibur gilot tevot elu. Right, this is the Beit Yosef agreeing with the Zohar, and he says this is a good solution. Says the Ramah, ve'im hayachid rotzeh gam kein lo amram. But if a person wants to say them as well, if a person wants to say Hashem Elokeichem emet with the chazan, there is no isur. And finally, here at the end, hold up. I'm sorry. At least it's here. V'yesha katvu dekol koresh Keriat Shema biyachid yomar kel Melech Ne'eman Shema. Ki gimel tevot elu mashimim haminyan shel Ramach v'hu b'makom amen sheish lanot amen achar baruch. So the Rama says there are people who say that if you're davening as an individual and you don't have a tzibur with you, and you're not going to hear Hashem Elokim emet, Hashem Elokeichem emet, then you have to say Kel Melech Ne'eman. That's their solution. If I'm davening with tzibur, then I follow the Zohar and I say Hashem Elokeichem emes. But if I'm davening alone, then I have to say Kel Melech Ne'eman. V'nirali b'kol makom kishakorim atzibur lo yomar Kel Melech Ne'eman rakumer amen achar shiach tzibur k'shemsayim bracha v'chein agin v'nachon hu. He says, my opinion is if you could avoid saying Kel Melech Ne'eman, especially when you're b'tzibur, avoid saying Kel Melech Ne'eman. Okay. All right. So this is essentially, we've just covered the halachic history of this. Originally, we have an ancient habit from the Jews in the Dark Ages, which appeared out of nowhere. And then we have the first reports of it coming from 11th century Italy. Just to recap, we find them giving an explanation for it based on a medrash, where the medrash says, and this is just to summarize, the medrash says there's 248 words in Keriat Shema. We don't have 248 words. They say this must be what Kel Melech Ne'eman is for. And when you fast forward, this minhag goes from Italy to Germany and France. And in Provence is the first time the Spanish scholars only hear about it in the mid 12th century or the late 12th century. When the Spanish scholars hear about it, they reject it. They say this is a hefsek. How could you add such a thing into the Shema? So they reject it outright. Even though it came from Provence to Catalonia, they rejected it. Okay, those are the first two steps. Now it gets rejected by the Spanish scholars. The Provençal scholars fight back. They say no, it's not a hefsek. It's b'makom amen, and you're trying to say it instead of amen. And the Spanish scholars say, well, maybe it was said for Amei Haaretz, for the ignoramuses, but not for the normal people. And we have this contention. And at the end of the 1200s, in the 1280s, we find the Zohar enlightens us with a new idea, which is Hashem Elokeichem Emet is the real solution for getting to 248, while Kel Melech Ne'eman should only be said biyachid. Should possibly only say, you should say that if you're an individual. So what ends up happening is that many sidurim will show Kel Melech Ne'eman, and they'll either not comment. If you look at, it's exhausting, all the sidurim in the past 500 years that were printed. But if you look at the printed sidurim, some of them will write it without comments. Some of them will write it with a comment, and they'll say, well, if you're biyachid, say this. If you're not biyachid, don't say this. Some of them will say, well, say this only if the shliach tzibur, if you finished before the shliach tzibur. So again, anybody can do whatever they feel comfortable with. If the or whatever the instructions in your siddur say, as long as it was vetted by a rabbi, you could do whatever you feel comfortable with. Lamaisa, you'll also find many charts, like a Keriat Shema Lamita, that's one area where it's definitely not a hefsek, and it became very popular when people printed in sidurim or on posters for Keriat Shema Lamita. They would put the words Kel Melech Ne'eman before Shema Yisrael. So once you see that prevalence of Kel Melech Ne'eman by Keriat Shema Lamita, you kind of wonder if that's where it originally came from. When you get all the way to the end of this and you see, like, wait, all the sidurim say Kel Melech Ne'eman before Keriat Shema Lamita because there's no hefsek over there. You wonder if that was just a habit. Was it a habit of Jewish people that for some reason they began saying Kel Melech Ne'eman before Keriat Shema Lamita, and then they brought that habit into the main liturgy? Well, we would never know, because we really just don't know where this comes from. But we do know that there's something about those words. There's something about saying the words Kel Melech Ne'eman, my God, my King, my faithful King, which resonated with people. There's some string in people's hearts that kind of strung. And this is very typical of important rituals. Important rituals that people do typically have stages. And if you look at most of the time when people invent a form of text, which is the anthropological term, or a ritual, which is used in, let's call it liminal states or in anxiety states, very often there's a preparatory period, there's the ritual itself, and then there's a de-escalation period. There's a couple of stages to how a ritual is performed. If someone's going to do a prayer, they prepare themselves for the prayer, they say the prayer, and then they dismiss themselves from the prayer. Just as an example, right? If people are going to say a prayer out of anxiety, they will prepare themselves, they'll say a prayer, and then they'll step away from that prayer. So it's very likely that when people said Shema Yisrael, they felt strange not saying a bracha before it. They felt strange not saying anything before it that was a preface. And somehow the words Kel Melech Ne'eman became the go-to preface for Shema Yisrael. And somehow as well, the words themselves were short enough, were memorable enough, were resonant enough that it lasted. And for at least 1100 years, Klal Yisrael has been saying Kel Melech Ne'eman. We don't know why, but as they say, Minhag Yisrael Torah, and this is one of those minhagim which probably God only himself understands. And it's one of those areas where we have to recognize that despite the halachic history of it, despite the possible pseudepigraphic history of it, and the polemics about whether or not it's a legitimate custom to begin with, tefillah is not just something that people pray. These are not just words that people pray. Tefillah is a thing people do. And sometimes words of tefillah, these are not just words to study. They are actions and thoughts and emotions and feelings to study. And the next time you say Kal Melech Ne'eman to yourself, it's worthwhile to ask yourself, what do you feel when you say Kal Melech Ne'eman? What kind of emotions does it evoke for you? When you recognize what kind of emotions Kal Melech Ne'eman evokes for you, you might have a window into the past as to what and why and how Kal Melech Ne'eman stuck to the Shema Yisrael and why that became a part of the tefillah over the past 1100 years. So with that, we're going to end our section on Kal Melech Ne'eman. Hopefully next week, I hope we'll talk about either Baruch Shem, if we have, I'm not sure if that's enough for a whole shiur, or we'll continue with MSV Atziv. So thank you everybody for your time and for your attention, and I'll see you all next week.